The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and white against the weathered wood of my porch. I almost didn't notice it at first, tucked beneath the usual stack of grocery store flyers and credit card offers, but something about the way it caught the light made me pause. Coffee mug halfway to my lips, steam curling up into the cool October air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. Or bam, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, formal and careful, with my name spelled out in full. Miss Rita Margaret Lawson. Not Rita, not Mrs. Lawson. The complete name, as if whoever wrote it wanted to make absolutely certain they had the right person. There was no return address, just a postmark from downtown Portland, dated 3 days earlier. I should have opened it right away. Looking back now, I realized that envelope contained the first crack in what I thought was my carefully constructed world. But instead, I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen counter next to the sugar bowl, and went about my morning routine. I had no way of knowing that within hours, that innocent piece of mail would reveal a truth so devastating, it would change everything I believed about my family, my life, and the son I thought I knew. The morning started like any other Tuesday in my modest ranch house on Maple Avenue. I've lived here for 37 years, ever since my late husband Thomas and I bought it as newlyweds, with dreams bigger than our bank account. The mortgage payments seemed impossible then, stretching our teacher salaries to the breaking point, but we made it work. We always made it work. Thomas passed away 8 months ago after a brutal fight with pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came in February, swift and merciless as a winter storm. By June, he was gone, leaving behind a half-finished crossword puzzle on his nightstand, and a silence so complete it felt like drowning. The house still smells faintly of his aftershave, Old Spice that clings to the bathroom cabinet no matter how many times I've cleaned it. Sometimes I catch myself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning before remembering I'm alone now. My name is Rita Lawson, and at 64, I thought I understood grief. I thought I understood loss. I thought I understood family. I was wrong about all of it. Thomas and I had been blessed with 2 children, though blessed might be too generous a word for what followed. Our daughter Sarah moved to Seattle 15 years ago for a tech job and calls every Sunday like clockwork, but the conversations feel scripted, polite. She sends Christmas cards with photos of her golden retriever and updates about her latest promotion. But she's never brought anyone home to meet us. I suspect she finds our small-town life suffocating, though she's too kind to say so. Then there's Mike, my firstborn. My pride, my greatest heartbreak. 42 years old, successful beyond anything Thomas and I ever imagined for ourselves. He runs a consulting firm in Chicago, drives a BMW that costs more than I made in 3 years of teaching, and married a woman who treats kindness like a weakness. Michael met Vanessa at some corporate event 5 years ago. She's beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that makes other women feel inadequate, just by existing in the same room. Blonde hair always perfectly styled, clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and a smile that never quite reaches her eye. When Thomas first met her, he whispered to me later that night, "She shakes hands like she's afraid she'll catch something." I laughed then, thinking he was being dramatic. I stopped laughing when I realized he was right. Vanessa comes from money, old money, the kind that builds wings on hospitals and has streets named after deceased patriarchs. Her father owns a chain of luxury hotels across the Midwest, and her mother sits on the boards of 3 different charities while employing a full-time housekeeper to manage their estate in Lake Forest. They live in a world where problems are solved with checkbooks and connections, where emotional inconveniences can be delegated to staff, or simply ignored until they disappear. From the moment Michael brought her home for Thanksgiving 4 years ago, I felt the shift. Not in him, exactly, but in how he saw us. Suddenly our worn furniture looked shabby instead of comfortable. Our family traditions seemed quaint rather than meaningful. The stories Thomas told about his childhood on the farm weren't charming anymore. They were embarrassing reminders of how far our family hadn't come. Vanessa never said anything directly. She was too well-bred for open cruelty. Instead, she would smile and nod and make helpful suggestions. Maybe I should consider updating the guest bathroom. Had I thought about hiring someone to help with the yard work since Thomas wasn't feeling well? Would I like her to send some recommendations for investment advisors, since I'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed by financial plans? Each suggestion felt like a small paper cut, insignificant alone but collectively drawing blood. I started second-guessing everything, wondering if our home really was as outdated as her polite observations implied. I found myself apologizing for things I'd never noticed before: the creaky floorboard in the hallway, the outdated wallpaper in the powder room, the way Thomas sometimes told the same story twice during dinner. Michael seemed oblivious to the subtle tension, or maybe he chose to ignore it. He was so clearly smitten, so proud of landing someone so sophisticated and beautiful. During that Thanksgiving visit, I watched him jump up to refill Vanessa's wine glass before she even asked, laughing too loudly at her jokes, steering conversations away from topics she seemed bored by. It was like watching my confident, successful son turn into an eager teenager desperate for approval. The wedding was everything I expected and nothing I wanted. Held at the Ritz-Carlton in Chicago with 300 guests I didn't know, and a price tag that could have funded a small college. Vanessa wore her grandmother's pearls and a dress that cost more than the car Thomas and I drove to the ceremony. The flowers were flown in from Holland, the menu featured ingredients I couldn't pronounce, and the band was apparently famous for playing at celebrity weddings. Thomas wore his good suit, the navy one he'd bought for Sarah's high school graduation 15 years earlier. It still fit perfectly, though the style was obviously dated compared to the sleek tuxedos worn by Vanessa's family. I wore the dress I'd bought for the occasion, navy blue with a modest neckline and three-quarter sleeves. Appropriate, I thought, for the mother of the groom. But standing in that opulent ballroom, surrounded by women draped in designer gowns and jewelry that caught the light like captured stars, I felt invisible. During the reception, I sat at table 12, far from the head table where Michael and Vanessa held court. Thomas tried to make conversation with the other guests, but we had nothing in common with these people. They discussed vacation homes in Aspen and charity galas, and their children's acceptance to Ivy League school. When someone asked what I did for work, I mentioned my 30 years teaching third grade at Lincoln Elementary. The woman smiled politely and immediately turned to discuss wine selections with her husband. I remember watching Michael during his father-son dance with Tom. The song was My Way by Frank Sinatra, a choice that felt both perfect and heartbreaking. Thomas had taught Michael to slow dance in our living room when he was 12, standing on his father's feet and giggling as they spun around the coffee table. Now my son towered over his father, guiding Thomas gently across the polished marble floor while 300 strangers watched and applauded politely. Thomas was already sick then, though we didn't know it yet. He tired easily during the reception, and I noticed him sitting more than dancing, but I attributed it to the long day and the stress of being around so many unfamiliar people. He kept checking his watch, and when I asked if he was okay, he smiled and said he was just ready to get back to the hotel. We left during the dessert course, hugging Michael goodbye and promising to call when we got home safely. That was the last family celebration we would all attend together. The months following the wedding brought subtle changes in Michael's behavior. Phone calls became less frequent, visits home even rarer. When he did call, Vanessa was often in the background, and I could hear her voice occasionally, though never directed at me. Michael would mention their busy social calendar, charity events, dinner parties with Vanessa's colleagues. Their lives sounded glamorous and exhausting, a constant whirl of obligations that left little time for family in Oregon. When Thomas was diagnosed, I called Michael immediately. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was sitting in Dr. Peterson's office, still processing words like aggressive and metastatic and limited options. My hands shook as I dialed Michael's number, not sure how to begin a conversation that would change everything. "Mom, what's wrong?" Michael's voice was sharp with concern. I could hear traffic in the background, the honking of Chicago rush hour. "It's your father," I managed, my voice catching on the words. "The doctors found something. Cancer. It's not good, hun." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Michael's voice came back, quieter now, strained. "How bad?" I told him everything Dr. Peterson had explained, the medical terms I was still learning to pronounce, the treatment options that offered hope, but no guarantee. Michael listened without interrupting. asking practical questions about doctors and hospitals and second opinions. He sounded like he was taking notes, processing the information with the same analytical approach he used for business problems. "I'll fly out this weekend," he said finally. "We'll figure this out, Mom. Dad's tough. He's going to beat this." But he didn't fly out that weekend, or the next. There was a crisis at work, he explained. A major client threatening to leave if Michael didn't personally handle their account. Then Vanessa came down with the flu and needed him home. Then there was a work conference in Denver that he couldn't miss. Thomas started chemotherapy in March. The treatments left him weak and nauseous, but he insisted on maintaining his routines as much as possible. He still read the newspaper every morning with his coffee, still worked in the garden when he felt strong enough, still told me I was beautiful even when I felt haggard from worry and sleepless nights. Michael called every few days to check on Thomas's progress.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But the conversations grew shorter and more businesslike. He would ask about test results and medication schedules, offering to research treatment centers or specialist doctors. But he never asked how Thomas was feeling emotionally, never shared memories or told him he loved him. It was as if he was managing a project rather than supporting his dying father. I made excuses for him at first. Michael was busy with work, overwhelmed by the distance, processing the news in his own way. Men handled grief differently, I told myself. He was probably struggling more than he let on, trying to be strong for both of us. But as weeks turned into months and Thomas grew sicker, the excuses felt thinner. The first time Michael actually visited after the diagnosis was in late April. He flew in on a Friday evening and was scheduled to leave Sunday afternoon, a quick 48-hour trip, squeezed between business obligations. I picked him up at the airport, shocked by how tired he looked. His usual confidence seemed forced, and he spent the drive home on his phone, dealing with what he described as a work emergency. Thomas had been having a particularly rough week, struggling with side effects from a new medication that left him exhausted and confused. But when he saw Michael walk through the front door, his face lit up with a joy that broke my heart. He struggled to sit up straighter in his recliner, running a hand through his thinning hair, and trying to smile away the evidence of his illness. "There's my boy," Thomas said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Look at you in that fancy suit. You look like $1,000,000. Michael hugged his father carefully, and I could see him trying not to react to how frail Thomas had become. The man who had once lifted Michael onto his shoulders and taught him to throw a curveball now weighed barely 140 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on his shrinking frame. We had dinner together that night, takeout from Thomas's favorite Italian restaurant, since I didn't trust myself to cook something he could actually eat. Michael told us about his work, about a new office they were opening in Phoenix, about Vanessa's latest charity project. He seemed determined to keep the conversation light, steering away from any mention of illness, or treatment, or the obvious changes in his father's appearance. Thomas tried to engage, asking questions about the business and remembering details from previous conversations, but the medication made it hard for him to concentrate. Twice he lost track of what Michael was saying mid-sentence, and once he asked the same question he'd asked 10 minutes earlier. Each time I saw Michael's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, frustration flickering across his features before he forced another smile. After dinner, Thomas fell asleep in his chair watching television. The medication did that, knocked him out suddenly and completely, leaving him snoring softly with his chin on his chest. Michael and I sat in the kitchen, and for the first time since his arrival, the forced cheerfulness dropped from his face. "He's really sick, isn't he?" Michael said quietly, staring into his coffee cup. "Yes," I replied simply. "He is." "How long do the doctors think?" "They don't give timelines anymore, but not long. Maybe months." Michael nodded slowly, absorbing this reality he'd been avoiding during our phone conversation. For a moment I thought he might cry, might finally let down the walls he'd built around his emotions. But then his phone buzzed with a text message, and the moment passed. He left the next morning instead of Sunday afternoon. "Another work crisis," he explained, apologizing profusely while packing his overnight bag. Vanessa had also called, he mentioned casually, something about needing him home for a dinner party with her parents. Thomas was still asleep when Michael left, knocked out by his morning medication, so they never got to say goodbye properly. I stood in the driveway watching Michael's rental car disappear around the corner, feeling something fundamental shift in my chest. It wasn't anger exactly, or even disappointment. It was something colder and more final, a recognition that my son was choosing his new life over his old one, and there was nothing I could do to change that. Thomas died on a Tuesday in June. It was quick at the end, a mercy after months of struggle. He passed away in his sleep at the hospice center, with me holding his hand and Sarah on speakerphone from Seattle, telling him stories about her new apartment and how much she loved him. Michael was in a meeting when I called, his assistant explained. She would give him the message as soon as he was available. He called back 3 hours later. By then Thomas was gone, and I was sitting in the parking lot of the funeral home, trying to make sense of decisions about caskets and flowers and burial plots. Michael's voice was thick with emotion when he finally reached me, full of regret and guilt and all the feelings he'd been too busy to express while his father was alive. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he kept saying. "I should have been there. I should have come home sooner." "Yes," I said quietly. "You should have." We planned the funeral for the following Saturday, giving Michael time to arrange his schedule and fly in from Chicago. Thomas had been specific about what he wanted: a simple service at First Methodist, the church where we'd been married 39 years earlier, followed by burial in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley he'd loved his entire life. Nothing fancy, no elaborate displays, just family and friends gathering to remember a good man who'd lived a quiet, meaningful life. The guest list was modest but heartfelt. Thomas's remaining siblings, a few cousins from his side of the family, neighbors who'd known us for decades, former colleagues from the school district where we'd both taught. Sarah flew in from Seattle, taking a week off work to help with arrangements and stay with me through the initial grief. She was everything Michael wasn't during those difficult days: present, helpful, emotionally available. Michael called every day leading up to the funeral, asking about details and making suggestions. He wanted to write a eulogy, he said, something to honor his father's memory. He asked about flowers, about music, about the guest list. For the first time in months he seemed fully engaged with our family, invested in doing right by Thomas even though it was too late. Then, on Thursday evening, 2 days before the funeral, Michael called with news that changed everything. "Mom, I need to talk to you about Saturday," he began, and something in his tone made my stomach clench. "What about Saturday?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. "There's been a complication. Vanessa's family is having this big anniversary party for her grandparents, their 60th wedding anniversary. It's been planned for over a year and apparently it's a huge deal. Her whole family will be there, important business contacts, people from her father's company." I waited for him to continue, to explain how this related to his father's funeral. "The thing is," Michael went on, his voice careful and measured like he was presenting a business proposal, "the timing is really unfortunate. The party is Saturday afternoon, the same time as Dad's service. Vanessa's really upset about it, and her family is expecting us to be there. It's kind of a command performance, you know." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually gripped the kitchen counter to steady myself, wondering if I'd misunderstood. "Are you telling me you're not coming to your father's funeral?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I'm coming, Mom. I wouldn't miss it, but I might have to leave early right after the service. Skip the reception at the church. Vanessa's already at her parents' house helping with last-minute arrangements, and I promised I'd be there by evening." "Mike," I closed my eyes, trying to process what I was hearing. "Your father is being buried on Saturday. Your father who raised you and loved you and worked 2 jobs to pay for your college education, and you're worried about missing a party. It's not just a party, Mom. It's family. Vanessa's family. These are important relationships for my business, for our future." Dad would understand that. He always said family comes first, but he also taught me about responsibility and keeping commitments. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Here was my son, talking about family and responsibility while planning to abandon his father's funeral for a social obligation. I wanted to scream, to hang up, to tell him exactly what I thought of his priority. Instead, I found myself negotiating, trying to salvage what little remained of his decency. "What if we moved the time?" I suggested desperately. "The funeral home, said they could do morning instead of afternoon. You could be there for the service and still make it to Chicago by evening. I don't know, Mom. That's really short notice, and Vanessa's expecting me to help with setup. Her mom specifically asked if I could be there early to help coordinate with the caterers. Caterers? My husband was dead, and my son was worried about cater. Michael, I said, my voice shaking now with an emotion I couldn't name. I am asking you as your mother to be at your father's funeral. I am asking you to put our family first, just this once. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, Michael sighed. Of course I'll be there, Mom. You're right, this is important. I'll figure something out with Vanessa's family. But even as he said the words, I could hear the reluctance in his voice. I could picture him already calculating, already figuring out how to minimize his time at the funeral to maximize his availability for his wife's family celebration. The conversation ended with promises and reassurances that felt hollow, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the terrible certainty that my son was going to disappoint me in the worst possible way. Friday night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Thomas's absence felt enormous, a silence that pressed against my chest and made breathing difficult. In 12 hours, we would bury the love of my life, and I wasn't even sure my own son would be there to witness it. Sarah called around midnight, unable to sleep in the guest room that still smelled faintly of Thomas's Old Spice. Are you okay, Mom? She asked quietly. No, I admitted, I don't think I am. Is it about Michael? I shouldn't have been surprised that she knew. Sarah had always been perceptive, even as a child. She saw through people's facades in ways that sometimes made family gatherings uncomfortable but always made her a reliable judge of character. He might not stay for the whole service, I said carefully, not wanting to completely betray my son's confidence, even as my heart broke over his choices. Because of Vanessa's family thing, so she already knew. Of course she knew. Michael had probably called her too, looking for support or understanding, or permission to prioritize his wife's family over his father's memory. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him that if he left Dad's funeral early, I'd never speak to him again. The fierce love in her voice made me cry for the first time since Thomas died, not the gentle tears of grief I'd been shedding all week, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside me. Sarah stayed on the phone, not trying to fix anything or offer empty comfort, just breathing with me across the hallway, until I finally fell asleep with the phone still pressed to my ear. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that matches grief perfectly. I dressed carefully in the black dress I'd bought for the occasion, pinned Thomas's mother's pearl brooch to the lapel, and tried to prepare myself for whatever version of my son would show up to say goodbye to his father. The funeral home was already bustling with activity when Sarah and I arrived an hour early. Friends and neighbors had sent flowers, more than I'd expected, creating a garden of sympathy around Thomas's simple casket. I'd chosen the oak one, mid-range in price, but beautiful in its simplicity. Thomas would have approved of the understated elegance, the way it suggested dignity without ostentation. People began arriving 30 minutes before the service, filling the small chapel with quiet conversation and shared memories. Miss Henderson, from next door, brought homemade cookies for the reception afterward. Tom's brother drove up from California with his wife and adult children. Former students, now grown with children of their own, came to pay respects to the teacher who'd believed in. But Michael was nowhere to be seen. I kept checking my phone, expecting a call or text with an explanation. Traffic delays, flight problems, something to explain his absence. Sarah squeezed my hand and whispered that he'd probably arrive at the last minute, that traffic from the airport could be unpredictable. But as the chapel filled and the service time approached, the empty space where my son should have been sitting felt like a physical wound. The pastor began the service at exactly 2 o'clock. He spoke beautifully about Thomas's life, his dedication to education, his love for his family, his quiet faith that sustained him through difficult times. Former colleagues shared stories about his patience with struggling students and his ability to find the potential in every child. Neighbors talked about his willingness to help with everything from broken lawnmowers to financial advice. Halfway through the service, the chapel door opened quietly, and Michael slipped inside. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray suit and black tie, but his face was flushed like he'd been hurrying. He found a seat in the back rather than joining Sarah and me in the front row, avoiding my eyes when I turned to acknowledge his arrival. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger. He was here, but barely. Late and sitting apart from family, checking his watch periodically like he had somewhere more important to be. I tried to focus on the pastor's words, on the celebration of Thomas's life, but I kept glancing back at Michael, watching him fidget and scroll through messages on his phone. When it came time for the eulogy, Michael walked to the front of the chapel with a folded paper in his hand. For a moment, seeing him standing behind the podium where Thomas had given readings during Sunday services, I felt hopeful. Maybe he would find the right word. Maybe he would honor his father's memory in a way that would heal the growing rift between us. The eulogy lasted exactly 4 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock, amazed by how quickly Michael summarized 39 years of his father's influence on his life. He touched on Thomas's work ethic, his integrity, his commitment to education. He mentioned favorite family vacations and proud moments like graduations and promotions. But the words felt rehearsed, generic, like something he might have pulled from a template online. There was no emotion in his voice, no personal stories that revealed the man Thomas had been behind closed doors, no mention of how Thomas had taught him to drive stick shift in the school parking lot, or how they'd spent countless Saturdays building model airplanes in the garage, or how Thomas had held him when he cried after his first heartbreak in high school. It was a eulogy for a stranger, delivered by someone eager to fulfill an obligation and move on. When Michael finished speaking and returned to his seat, I felt something fundamental break inside me. This wasn't grief anymore. This was recognition. My son, the boy I'd raised to value family and loyalty, and doing the right thing even when it was difficult, had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who could reduce his father's life to 4 minutes of corporate speak and consider it sufficient. The service concluded with Thomas's favorite hymn, "How Great Thou Art," sung by a congregation that had genuinely loved him. As we filed out of the chapel for the short drive to the cemetery, Michael appeared at my elbow. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. My heart sank. I already knew what he was going to say. "The graveside service," he began, confirming my worst fears. "I'm really sorry, but I can't stay. My flight leaves in 2 hours, and with traffic." "Your flight," I repeated the words, slowly, testing how they felt in my mouth. "You booked a flight that leaves before your father is buried." I had to. The anniversary party starts at 6, and Vanessa's family is expecting us. Her grandmother specifically asked about meeting me. It's really important to Vanessa that I be there. Important to Vanessa, the woman who'd met Thomas exactly 3 times and couldn't be bothered to attend his funeral. The woman whose grandfather's birthday party was apparently more significant than my husband's burial. "So you're leaving?" I said. It wasn't a question. "I'm really sorry, I know this looks bad, but you have to understand my position. This is my wife's family. These are relationships I need to maintain for our future. Our future. Not our family's future. Not his relationship with his mother or his sister or the memory of his father. His future with Vanessa, and her money, and her connections and her grandmother who needed to meet him at a party." I said quietly. "Mom, please don't be angry. Dad would understand. He always said." "Go," I repeated, more firmly this time. Michael hesitated, perhaps hoping I would change my mind or offer forgiveness, or tell him it was okay to abandon his father's burial for a social obligation. When I said nothing more, he kissed my cheek quickly and walked toward the parking lot, pulling out his phone as he went. I watched him drive away in his rental car, probably already calling Vanessa to report that he'd fulfilled his minimal obligation, and was on his way to what really mattered. Sarah appeared beside me, linking her arm through mine without saying anything. She didn't need to. We both understood that something had just ended, something more final than death. The graveside service was small and intimate, exactly what Thomas would have wanted. We stood around the simple headstone I'd chosen, listening to the pastor read from Ecclesiastes about seasons and purposes under heaven. Sarah cried quietly beside me, and I found myself surrounded by people who had genuinely loved Thomas, who understood that this moment mattered, who believed that witnessing the end of a good man's life was worth their time and attention. As they lowered the casket into the ground, I thought about the letter that was waiting for me at home. The letter from the attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss Thomas's will and estate planning. The letter that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. Michael had made his now it was time for me to make mine. The attorney's office smelled like leather and old coffee, the kind of place where serious conversations happened behind heavy wooden doors. I sat across from Mr. Davidson, Thomas's longtime lawyer, trying to focus on his words while my mind kept drifting back to the cemetery, to the sight of Michael's rental car disappearing while his father's casket was still being lowered into the ground. "Mrs. Lawson, are you following me?" Miss Davidson's gentle voice pulled me back to the present. He was a kind man in his 70s, someone Thomas had trusted for over 20 years with everything from our house purchase to updating our wills after the children were born. "I'm sorry," I said, shaking my head to clear the fog of grief and exhaustion. "Could you repeat that last part?" He nodded sympathetically, clearly accustomed to dealing with widows who were struggling to process important information while their world was still tilting off its axis. "I was explaining that Thomas made some significant changes to his will about 6 months ago. He wanted to ensure that his final wishes were very specific and legally binding. 6 months ago, that would have been right after his diagnosis, when the reality of his mortality was still fresh and terrifying. I remembered Thomas spending long hours at his desk during that period, organizing papers and making phone calls, but he'd been so private about it all. When I asked what he was working on, he just said he was getting our affairs in order, nothing for me to worry about. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would be complicated. Miss Davidson opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents, spreading them across his desk like he was dealing cards. "The primary change involves the inheritance structure for your children. Thomas was very concerned about ensuring that his legacy would honor the values he held most dear." I stared at the papers covered in legal language that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. "I don't understand. We always planned to split everything equally between Michael and Sarah. Half and half, simple. That was the original plan. Yeah, but Thomas became increasingly worried about Michael's priorities, particularly after his marriage to Vanessa. Your husband was quite specific about his concerns during our meetings." The words hit me like a slap. Thomas had been worried about Michael's priorities, worried enough to change his will without telling me. I thought about all those evenings when Thomas would go quiet during our phone calls with Michael, the way his face would tighten when Michael mentioned expensive purchases or lavish vacations. I'd attributed it to the generation gap, the natural disconnect between a man who'd grown up during the Depression and a son who'd never wanted for anything. "What exactly did he change?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. Miss Davidson cleared his throat and began reading from the document in his formal, careful tone. "The estate, valued at approximately $450,000 including the house, life insurance and retirement account, will be distributed as follows. Sarah Margaret Lawson will receive her father's personal effects, the photo albums, and a cash inheritance of $75,000. I nodded. That seemed reasonable. Generous even considering Sarah's successful career and financial independence. "Michael Thomas Lawson," Mr. Davidson continued, "will receive a cash inheritance of $50,000, contingent upon his attendance at his father's funeral and burial services." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say contingent upon attendance?" "Yes. Thomas was very specific about this requirement. If Michael failed to attend both the funeral and burial in their entirety, his inheritance would be redirected." My mind Thomas had somehow known, 6 months before he died, that Michael might not show up for his own father's funeral. Or maybe he'd hoped that the financial incentive would ensure Michael's presence, would guarantee that our son would put family obligations above social convenience. Redirected, I asked, though my stomach was already clenching with the answer. To the Children's Cancer Research Foundation of Oregon, in Thomas's name, the entire $50,000, plus an additional $50,000 from the contingency fund he established specifically for this purpose, $100,000. Thomas had been prepared to donate $100,000 to charity rather than let Michael inherit money he hadn't earned through basic human decency. I thought about Michael leaving the graveside service early, hurrying to catch his flight to Chicago, prioritizing Vanessa's grandmother's anniversary party over his father's burial. According to the terms Thomas had established, my son had just forfeited his inheritance to a children's cancer charity. Did Michael know about this condition? I asked. Thomas debated whether to tell him. He ultimately decided that if Michael attended out of genuine love and respect, the money would be secondary. If he attended only for financial gain, then he didn't deserve the inheritance anyway. Thomas believed that doing the right thing shouldn't require a bribe. I could hear Thomas's voice in those words, his quiet moral certainty that had guided our family for 39 years. He'd always believed that character was revealed through actions, not intention. You could tell everything you needed to know about a person by watching what they did when no one was looking, when there was no reward for good behavior except the satisfaction of being decent. There's more, Mr. Davidson said gently. Thomas left you a letter to read after the will was explained. He wanted you to understand his reasoning. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Thomas's careful handwriting. Just seeing those familiar letters made my eyes fill with tears. I could picture him sitting at our kitchen table, choosing each word carefully, trying to explain decisions that would affect our family for years to come. Would you like privacy to read this? Mr. Davidson asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He stepped out of the office, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone with my husband's final thoughts about our son. The letter was written on Thomas's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper we'd bought him for Christmas years ago, that he saved for important correspondence. His handwriting was shaker than usual, evidence of the medication and illness that had weakened him during his final months, but the words were clear and deliberate. My dearest Rita, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're learning about the changes I made to our will. I know this probably comes as a shock, and I wish I could be there to explain my reasoning in person, to hold your hand while you process what this means for our family. I want you to know that this decision didn't come easily. I spent months wrestling with it, praying about it, trying to find another way, but as my illness progressed and I watched Michael's behavior, I became convinced that leaving him money without requiring him to earn it would be the worst thing I could do for his character. Our son has lost his way, Rita. I don't know if it happened gradually, or all at once, but somewhere along the line, he stopped being the boy we raised, and became someone who measures everything in terms of personal advantage. The Michael we knew would never have missed his grandfather's funeral for a business meeting. He would never have treated you with the casual dismissal I've witnessed during his visits. He would never have married someone who looks at our life with such obvious disdain. I know you've made excuses for him, the way mothers do. You've blamed his busy schedule, the pressure of his career, the influence of his new family. But making excuses for someone doesn't help them grow. It just enables them to continue making poor choices without consequence. The truth is, I don't trust Michael to honor my memory or take care of you if something happens to your health or finances. I've seen how he talks to you, how he rushes through phone calls and cuts visits short. I've watched him become someone who thinks money can substitute for presence, who believes that being successful in business excuses him from being decent in relationships. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that when the time comes, Michael will choose to be present for my funeral not because of money, but because of love. If he does, if he proves that family still matters to him more than social obligations, then he'll receive his inheritance and hopefully never know about this condition. But if he doesn't, if he chooses convenience over commitment, then I want my money to go somewhere it can do actual good in the world. I want it to help children who are fighting for their lives, who understand the value of time and presence, because they might not have much of either. I need you to know that this isn't about punishment, it's about accountability. Michael has enough money to live comfortably. What he lacks is character, and money can't buy that. Maybe losing an inheritance he didn't earn will remind him that some things in life can't be purchased or postponed or delegated to others. I also need you to know that whatever happens, you are not responsible for Michael's choices. You raised him with love and values, and every advantage we could provide. If he's chosen to abandon those values for the sake of impressing his wife's family, that's his decision, not your failure. Take care of yourself, my darling. Don't spend your remaining years trying to fix a relationship that Michael broke. You deserve better than crumbs of attention from a son who should be grateful every day for the mother he was blessed with. I love you more than words can express. I always have. I always will. Your devoted husband, Thomas. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Thomas had seen everything I'd been trying to ignore, had understood the painful truth I'd been unwilling to face. Our son had become someone we didn't recognize, someone who prioritized appearance over authenticity, status over substance. The cruel irony was that Michael would have attended the funeral if he'd known about the inheritance condition. He would have canceled his flight, disappointing Vanessa's family, sitting through the entire graveside service with gritted teeth and barely concealed impatience. But he would have been there for the money, not for love, which was exactly what Thomas had hoped to avoid. When Mr. Davidson returned to the office, I was still holding the letter, tears streaming down my face but feeling something else underneath the grief. Relief maybe, or vindication. Thomas had seen what I'd been afraid to acknowledge, had put into words the disappointment I'd been carrying like a stone in my chest. "Are you all right, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked, settling back into his chair with the careful movements of a man who'd delivered difficult news to many families over the years. "I think so," I said honestly. "What happens next?" "We'll need to verify that the conditions of the will weren't met. I'll need a witness statement confirming that Michael left the burial service early." Sarah mentioned she would be willing to provide that documentation. Of course she would. Sarah had seen everything, had watched her brother choose Vanessa's family over his own father's final goodbye. She understood the significance of that choice in ways that Michael clearly didn't. "Then we'll process the charitable donation and notify Michael of the change in his inheritance." Thomas wanted him to understand exactly why he forfeited the money, hoped it might serve as a wake-up call. A wake-up call. I wondered if Michael was capable of waking up, or if he was too deeply asleep in his new life to recognize what he'd lost. "There's one more thing," Mr. Davidson said, pulling out another document. "Thomas established a small discretionary fund for you to use as you see fit. He called it the Dignity Fund, $25,000 that you can access immediately, no questions asked, no restrictions." I stared at the number on the paper. $25,000, more money than I'd ever had control over in my entire life. Thomas and I had always made financial decisions together, budgeting carefully, discussing every major purchase. The idea of having money that was completely mine felt foreign and frightening, and somehow liberating. He said you might need it for things like home repairs or medical expenses, or just the freedom to make choices without worrying about the cost. Mr. Davidson explained, he wanted you to have independence, especially if Michael proved unreliable as a support system. Thomas had thought of everything, had prepared for possibilities I hadn't even considered. He'd anticipated that Michael might not be someone I could depend on, had given me the resources to take care of myself without having to ask my son for help, or accept his grudging assistance. I left the attorney's office in a daze, carrying copies of documents that would change everything about my family's future. The afternoon sun seemed too bright after the dim interior of the law office, and I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what I'd learned. Thomas had known. 6 months before he died, he'd understood that our son was becoming someone who would prioritize social obligations over family loyalty. He'd hoped Michael would prove him wrong, but he'd prepared for the likelihood that our boy was already too far gone to say. The drive home took me past the cemetery where Thomas now rested under a blanket of fresh flowers. I pulled over and walked to his grave, kneeling on the damp grass despite my good dress, not caring if I stained the black fabric. "You knew," I whispered to the granite headstone. "You knew he'd leave early." The wind rustled through the oak trees. Thomas had loved, and I imagined I could hear his voice in the sound. He'd always been practical, had always planned for contingencies. Of course he'd seen the warning signs I'd been too hopeful to acknowledge. What do I do now? I asked the silence. How do I tell him? But even as I asked the question, I realized I already knew the answer. I would tell Michael the truth. All of it, without sugarcoating or making excuses. I would explain exactly what his choice had cost him, what his father had thought of his priorities, what kind of legacy he'd chosen to embrace, and then I would let him live with the consequences, the way Thomas had intended. That evening I called Sarah. She was still in town, staying at a hotel near the airport before her flight back to Seattle the next morning. When I explained what I'd learned at the lawyer's office, she was quiet for a long moment. Dad really did that? She finally asked. He really did. Good for him, she said firmly. Michael earned exactly what he deserved. I have to call him tonight, tell him what happened. Do you want me to be there? I could drive over, sit with you while you make the call. The offer was tempting, but this was something I needed to do alone. Thank you, sweetheart, but I think this conversation needs to be just between Michael and me. Okay, but call me afterward, no matter how late. I want to know how he takes it. After we hung up, I sat in the living room where Thomas and I had shared so many quiet evenings, trying to figure out how to begin a conversation that would probably end my relationship with my son. How do you tell someone that their father knew they would fail a basic test of human decency? How do you explain that love comes with expectations, and that failing to meet those expectations has consequences? I decided to be direct. Michael was a businessman. He understood contracts and conditions, and outcomes. I would explain the situation in terms he could grasp, without emotion or dramatics, just facts and results. I dialed his number at 8 o'clock Chicago time, when I knew he'd be home from Vanessa's family celebration. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, and I could hear music and laughter in the background. Mom, how did the rest of the day go? I'm really sorry I had to leave early. No, he wasn't. He was calling from what sounded like a party, probably feeling relieved that he'd managed to fulfill his minimal obligation, and still make it to the important event. But I didn't point out the contradiction between his words and his tone. Michael, I need to discuss something important with you. Is this a good time to talk? Sure, just let me step outside. The party's still going strong here. Of course it was. While I'd been sitting in a lawyer's office, learning about my husband's final disappointment in his son, Michael had been celebrating someone else's marriage milestone. Okay, I'm on the terrace now. What's going on? I took a deep breath and began. I met with Mr. Davidson today, to discuss your father's will. There were some conditions in the inheritance that you weren't aware of. Conditions? What kind of conditions? I explained the terms as clearly as Miss Davidson had explained them to me.
The $50,000 inheritance contingent upon full attendance at both funeral and burial, the redirection of funds to charity if the conditions weren't met, the additional $50,000 that would accompany the donation. Michael was silent for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Michael? Are you there? I'm here. His voice was different now, tight and controlled. Are you telling me that Dad cut me out of his will because I left the burial early? I'm telling you that your father established conditions for your inheritance, and those conditions weren't met. This is insane. I was there for the funeral. I gave the eulogy. I paid my respects. You left before your father was buried, Michael. You chose to attend a party instead of seeing your father to his final rest. It wasn't just a party, Mom. It was family. Vanessa's family. These are important relationships. More important than your father? The question hung between us like a challenge. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him calculating, trying to find an argument that would justify his choice. That's not fair, he said finally. Dad was already gone. The burial was just ceremony. It wasn't going to bring him back or change anything. It would have changed your inheritance. I didn't know about that. Exactly. Your father wanted to see if you would do the right thing without a financial incentive. You didn't. So what? Now I get nothing. You get nothing. And $100,000 goes to the Children's Cancer Research Foundation in your father's name. I could hear the party continuing in the background. Could imagine Michael standing on some elegant terrace overlooking Lake Michigan, while his wife's family celebrated inside, oblivious to the phone call that was unraveling his financial expectations. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "Dad was sick when he wrote this will. He wasn't thinking clearly. We can contest it. Your father was completely lucid when he met with Mr. Davidson, and he left me a letter explaining his reasoning. Would you like me to read it to you?" "No," he said quickly. "I don't want to hear it." Because he already knew what it would say. He knew his father had seen through the facade, had recognized that Michael's priorities had shifted away from family and toward advancement in a social circle that valued appearances over authenticity. "Michael," I said gently, "your father hoped you would prove him wrong. He wanted you to choose family over convenience, to show that the values he taught you still mattered. When you left early yesterday, you made your choice clear. I can't believe this. I can't believe Dad would do this to me." "Your father didn't do anything to you. You did this to yourself." The silence stretched again, and I could hear the sounds of celebration continuing in the background. Michael's new family was probably wondering where he'd disappeared to, probably assuming he was dealing with some tedious detail from his father's funeral. "What about you?" he asked finally. "Do you agree with this?" The question was a test, and we both knew it. He was asking if I would stand with him against Thomas's decision, if I would support him in feeling victimized rather than holding him accountable for his choices. "I think your father knew you better than either of us wanted to admit," I said quietly. "So you're taking his side." "I'm accepting his judgment. And Michael, after watching you leave your father's burial for a party, I can't say I disagree with it." "Fine," he said, and I could hear the anger hardening in his voice. "If that's how you both feel, then maybe it's better this way. Maybe it's better if I just focus on my real family, the people who actually appreciate what I bring to their lives." His real family. The words hit me like a physical blow, confirming what I'd been afraid to acknowledge. In Michael's mind, Vanessa's wealthy, connected, socially prominent family had replaced the people who'd raised him and loved him and sacrificed for his education and success. "If that's what you choose," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the pain spreading through my chest. "It is what I choose. Don't expect to hear from me anytime soon, Mom. I need time to process this betrayal." "Betrayal?" He saw his father's moral standards as a betrayal, saw accountability as persecution. The boy who'd once cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant had become a man who viewed consequences as unfair punishment. "I understand," I said. "Take all the time you need." The line went dead. Michael had hung up without saying goodbye, without expressing any sorrow for my loss or concern for how I would manage as a new widow. His first instinct hadn't been to comfort his grieving mother, but to calculate his financial losses and assign blame for his disappointment. I sat in the darkening living room, still holding the phone, feeling something settle into place inside me. Thomas had been right about our son. Michael had revealed exactly who he'd become, and it wasn't someone either of us recognized as the child we'd raised. But Thomas had also been right about something else. I wasn't responsible for Michael's choices. I'd done my best as a mother, had loved him unconditionally, and given him every advantage I could provide. If he'd chosen to trade those values for social advancement, if he'd decided that Vanessa's family offered him more than his own, then that was his decision to make, and his consequence to bear. The next morning, I called the Children's Cancer Research Foundation to let them know about the unexpected donation that would be coming their way. The development director was stunned by the amount and the circumstances, moved by the story of a father who'd chosen to help sick children rather than enable his son's selfishness. "We'll establish a memorial fund in your husband's name," she assured. "This gift will help fund research that could save lives. Your husband's legacy will make a real difference." Thomas's legacy. Not money passed down to someone who hadn't earned it, but resources directed toward children who were fighting battles they didn't choose, who understood the value of time and love because both were precious and limited. That afternoon I walked through the house Thomas and I had shared for 37 years, seeing it with new eyes. It was smaller than Michael's house in Chicago, less grand than Vanessa's family estate, but it was filled with memories of a life well lived. Photographs of camping trips and school plays and quiet Sunday mornings, books we'd read together, furniture we'd saved up to buy, a garden Thomas had tended with patient care. This was my legacy too, not the wealth or status Michael had married into, but the life Thomas and I had built through small daily choices to love each other and our children and our community. I didn't need my son's approval to find value in that life. Didn't need his presence to feel proud of what we'd accomplished together. I picked up Thomas's letter from the kitchen table where I'd left it the night before, reading his words one more time. He'd known this day would come, had understood that Michael was already lost to us long before he died, but he'd also trusted me to handle the aftermath with dignity, to refuse to chase after a son who'd made his priorities clear. For the first time since Thomas's diagnosis, I felt like I could breathe fully. The worst had happened. The truth had been revealed, and I was still standing. Michael had made his choice, just as Thomas had predicted. Now it was time for me to make mine. The silence that followed Michael's abrupt hang-up wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, crackling with the energy of a life suddenly freed from the weight of disappointing expectation. I sat in my living room for nearly an hour after the call ended, not moving, just absorbing the reality that my son had essentially dismissed me from his life over money he'd never earned. The strangest part was how little it hurt. Oh, there was pain. Certainly, the deep ache of watching someone you love transform into someone you barely recognize, but underneath that familiar grief was something unexpected. For the first time in years, I didn't have to make excuses for Michael's behavior or pretend his choices didn't reflect poorly on the values Thomas and I had tried to instill. The pretense was over. I slept better that night than I had since Thomas's diagnosis 9 months earlier. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the bedroom windows, and I could hear birds chattering in the oak tree outside. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if a heavy presence had been lifted from the room. Sarah called while I was having my morning coffee, her voice tight with concern. "How did Michael take the news?" "About as well as you'd expect," I said, stirring honey into my tea. "He hung up on me after informing me that Vanessa's family is his real family now." "He actually said that?" "He did." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this final confirmation of what we'd both suspected. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know this isn't how you wanted things to end with him. Honestly, sweetheart, I think this is how things needed to end. Your father saw something I wasn't ready to accept, and maybe it took losing Michael's inheritance for me to finally understand what we were dealing with." So what happens now? It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself since hanging up the phone. What did happen now? For 39 years, my identity had been built around being Thomas's wife and mother to 2 children. Now Thomas was gone, and Michael had essentially removed himself from my life. I was 64 years old with a paid-off house, a modest inheritance, and no idea who I was supposed to be now. "I think I'm going to figure out how to live for myself," I said, surprised by how sure I sounded. "Good for you," Sarah said firmly. "You deserve that." After we hung up, I walked through the house, really looking at it for the first time since Thomas died. We'd lived here so long that I'd stopped seeing the details. The way you stop noticing a song that's been playing in the background for decades. But now, with fresh eyes, I noticed things that needed attention. The wallpaper in the guest bathroom was peeling at the corner. The hardwood floors were scratched and dull from years of daily life. The kitchen cabinets, once a cheerful yellow, had faded to something closer to mustard. These weren't problems exactly, but they were chances to make choices based on my preferences instead of what Thomas liked, or what would impress Michael and Vanessa during their increasingly rare visits. I spent the morning making lists, not of chores or obligations, but of possibility. What if I painted the living room that soft blue I'd always admired? What if I finally planted the herb garden I'd been talking about for years? What if I bought new furniture that actually fit my body instead of accommodating Thomas's longer frame? The phone rang around noon, and for a brief moment, my heart jumped with the foolish hope that it might be Michael calling to apologize. Instead, it was Mrs. Henderson from next door, asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. "That's very kind, but I think I'll go myself," I said. I need to get out of the house. Of course, dear, just remember, if you need anything at all, Dan and I are right here. Mrs. Henderson had been our neighbor for 22 years, ever since she and her husband bought the house next door when their own children left home. She was one of those naturally nurturing people who noticed when your newspaper piled up or when you hadn't been seen in the garden for a few days. During Thomas's illness, she'd brought casseroles twice a week and never made me feel like charity. Actually, I said, making a sudden decision, would you like to have coffee sometime this week, just to visit? I'd love that, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. How about Wednesday afternoon? After making plans with Miss Henderson, I drove to the grocery store for the first time since the funeral. It was a simple errand. Nothing dramatic, but it felt significant somehow. I was choosing to leave the house, to engage with the world, to buy food for meals I would cook and eat alone without apologizing for my solitude. The produce section was bright and colorful, full of possibilities I hadn't considered when I was cooking for Thomas's restricted diet during his illness. I bought strawberries because I loved them, avocados because they reminded me of California, fresh basil because I'd always wanted to grow my own but never had the confidence to try. My cart filled with choices that were entirely mine, free from the considerations that had governed my shopping for decades. At the checkout, the cashier was a young woman I didn't recognize, probably a college student working part-time. She handled my purchases with the efficient friendliness of someone who'd learned to make small talk with hundreds of customers each day. Having a good day? She asked as she rang up the basil. You know what? I said, surprising myself with the answer. I think I am. She smiled, perhaps picking up on something in my tone that suggested this was news to me too. That's wonderful. Days like that are precious. Days like that are precious. Such a simple observation from someone who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. But it stayed with me as I drove home. How many good days had I missed? Because I was too focused on managing other people's moods or meeting their expectations. How many possibilities had I dismissed because they didn't fit into the narrow role I'd assigned myself? That evening, I did something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I rearranged my bedroom furniture. Thomas had always preferred the bed positioned against the far wall, claiming it gave him a better view of the door. I'd never questioned this preference, even though it meant I had to walk around the bed to get to my side. But Thomas wasn't coming back, and I wanted to wake up looking out the window at the garden instead of at the hallway. Moving the heavy oak dresser by myself was probably not the wisest decision for a 64-year-old woman, but it felt important to do it alone, to prove to myself that I could reshape my environment without asking for help or permission. By the time I finished, my back was sore and I was slightly out of breath, but the room looked completely different, better. Mine. I slept in the repositioned bed that night, waking to sunlight streaming across my pillow instead of hitting the far wall. Such a small change, but it felt like a revolution. The next few days established a new rhythm. I woke when my body felt ready instead of setting an alarm. I ate breakfast slowly, reading the newspaper thoroughly instead of skimming it for highlights to discuss with Thomas. I called Sarah to chat rather than waiting for her scheduled Sunday call. I started a crossword puzzle, and didn't feel guilty about leaving it unfinished when I grew bored. On Wednesday, Mrs. Henderson came over for coffee as planned. I'd spent the morning baking chocolate chip cookies from scratch, not because I felt obligated to play hostess, but because the smell of baking had always comforted me. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Thomas and I had shared thousands of meals, but the conversation was entirely different. You seem different, Mrs. Henderson observed as she accepted her second cookie. Lighter somehow. I feel different, I admit. I'm not sure if it's good different, or just different. Change is always unsettling, she said gently. But you know, Dan and I have been watching you carry so much worry these past few years, first with Thomas's illness, then with your son's behavior. It's nice to see you without that weight on your shoulders. Mrs. Henderson had noticed Michael's behavior too, had seen what I'd been trying to ignore. It was oddly comforting to know that other people had witnessed the gradual erosion of respect and kindness, that I hadn't imagined the coldness or the casual dismissals. Can I ask you something personal? She continued. I nodded, curious about what she wanted to know. Are you planning to stay in the house? It's quite large for one person, and I know the memories might be difficult. It was a practical question, one I'd been avoiding since Thomas died. The house held 40 years of shared life, but it also held mortgage-free equity and the security of familiar neighbors. Moving would mean starting over completely, but staying meant learning to live with ghosts. I think I'm going to stay, I said, realizing as I spoke that I'd already made the decision, but I might make some changes. What kind of changes? Paint, maybe new furniture. I'm thinking about turning Thomas's office into a reading room, with a comfortable chair and better lighting. Maybe even a small greenhouse in the backyard for herbs and vegetables. Mrs. Henderson's face lit up. Oh, that sounds wonderful. Dan's quite handy with construction if you need help with anything major. He'd love to have a project now that he's retired. The offer was generous and practical, but more than that, it represented something I was just beginning to understand: community. The idea that I could be part of a network of people who helped each other not out of obligation or guilt, but out of genuine care and mutual benefit. I might take you up on that, I said. Please do. We've been married 34 years, and I can tell you from experience that having a purpose makes all the difference when you're adjusting to a new phase of life. After Miss Henderson left, I found myself looking at Thomas's office with new eyes. It was a small room off the living room that he'd used for paying bills and organizing tax documents. The furniture was purely functional: a metal desk, a filing cabinet, and a chair that had never been comfortable for anyone. But it had a large window that faced south, perfect for plants, and built-in bookshelves that could hold more than financial records. I spent the rest of the afternoon emptying the office, sorting through papers and deciding what needed to be kept versus what could be discarded. Thomas had been meticulous about record keeping, filing away documents that were decades old and probably irrelevant, but mixed in with the tax returns and insurance policies, I found treasures I'd forgotten exist. A folder marked Rita's teaching contained copies of every positive note I'd ever received from parents, every thank you card from students, every evaluation praising my classroom management or creative lesson plan. Thomas had saved them all, even the ones I'd thrown away because I thought they were too sentimental to keep. Another folder held articles I'd clipped from magazines about gardening and home decorating, ideas I'd mentioned wanting to try someday when we had more time or money. The service included readings from various spiritual traditions and a thoughtful discussion about finding meaning in times of transition. The congregation was diverse in age and background, united not by shared beliefs but by shared questions about how to live with integrity and purpose. After the service, I was approached by a woman with silver hair and a warm smile. "I don't think we've met," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Chen. Are you visiting or thinking about joining us?" "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "I'm exploring options." "Good for you. Exploration is healthy, especially during major life changes. I noticed you were really engaged during the discussion about reinvention." Margaret turned out to be a retired social worker who'd started attending the fellowship after her divorce 3 years earlier. She understood the challenge of rebuilding identity after a major life change, and she invited me to join a monthly book club that met at the fellowship. "We read everything from philosophy to fiction to memoirs," she explained. "But really, we just enjoy having thoughtful conversations with people who aren't afraid to ask big questions." I accepted her invitation, adding another new element to my increasingly unfamiliar life. On the drive home, I reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. New paint colors, new social connections, new spiritual exploration, new educational plans. Each change was small individually, but collectively, they represented a fundamental shift in how I approached my days. The phone was ringing when I walked into the house. For a moment, my old reflexes kicked in, and I hoped it might be Michael calling to reconcile, but the caller ID showed Sarah's number, and I felt relieved rather than disappointed. "How are you doing, Mom?" she asked without preamble. "I'm doing well," I said, and for the first time in months, it was completely true. I'm making some changes to the house, exploring new activities. It feels good to have projects again. That's wonderful. And Michael? Have you heard from him? No, and I don't expect to. I think he's made his position clear. I'm sorry about that. I know you hoped he might come around. Actually, I think I'm past hoping for that. Michael is who he's chosen to be, and that's not someone I can build a relationship with. It took me too long to accept that, but I'm there now. Sarah was quiet for a moment, perhaps surprised by my matter-of-fact tone. You sound different, Mom. Stronger. I feel strong. Your father left me some money that I can use however I want, and for the first time in my adult life, I'm making decisions based on what I want instead of what other people need or expect. What kind of decisions? I told her about the painting, the classes, the book club, the gardening plan. As I described my new activities, I realized how full my life was becoming, how many possibilities existed when I stopped limiting myself to the narrow role of devoted wife and accommodating mother. I'm proud of you, Sarah said finally. Dad would be proud too. I think he would. I found a notebook in his office, where he'd written down all the things I'd mentioned wanting to try over the years. It was like he was keeping a list for me to discover later. That sounds exactly like something Dad would do. He always believed in you more than you believed in yourself. After we hung up, I sat in my living room, looking at the furniture that would soon be surrounded by fresh blue walls. The room would look completely different in a week, but the change had already begun inside me. I was no longer the woman who apologized for taking up space, who made herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort, who measured her worth by how successfully she managed other people's needs. I was becoming someone I'd never had the chance to be, a woman who made choices based on her own preferences, who pursued interest because they brought her joy, who built relationships with people who appreciated her company rather than simply tolerating it. The transformation wasn't complete, probably would never be complete, but it was real, and it was mine, and for the first time in longer than I could remember that felt like enough. The transformation of my house took on a life of its own once Robert and his crew arrived on Monday morning. Watching them spread drop cloths and tape off trim work, I felt like I was witnessing the physical manifestation of the emotional changes that had been building inside me for weeks. The familiar walls that had held 40 years of memories were about to become something entirely new. Robert worked with quiet efficiency, occasionally asking my opinion about technique or color saturation. I found myself making decisions quickly and confidently, trusting my instincts in ways I hadn't for years. When he suggested that the blue might look better with a slightly different undertone, I considered his advice but ultimately chose the shade I'd originally selected. It was a small moment of self-assertion, but it felt significant. By Wednesday, the living room had been completely transformed. The soft blue walls made the space feel larger and brighter, while the fresh white trim brought a crispness that had been missing for years. I stood in the doorway that evening, amazed by how different the room felt. It was still my home, still filled with furniture and photographs that told the story of my life with Thomas, but now it also reflected something new, my own taste, my own vision for how I wanted to live. The office renovation proved even more dramatic. Robert's crew had installed new hardwood flooring to replace the worn carpet, and the warm yellow walls created a cocoon of light and comfort. I'd ordered a reading chair in sage green fabric, along with a small writing desk positioned to take advantage of the southern exposure. The built-in shelves, once filled with decades of tax returns and financial documents, now held books I'd been meaning to read and plants I'd impulsively purchased at the garden center. On Thursday afternoon, while the painters finished the final trim work, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the director of the Children's Cancer Research Foundation. Her voice was warm and professional as she introduced herself and explained the reason for her call. Miss Lawson, I wanted to personally thank you and your late husband for the extraordinary donation that's being processed in his memory. $100,000 will fund significant research initiatives, and we're deeply moved by the circumstances that led to this gift. I found myself explaining the whole story to Dr. Rodriguez, perhaps because talking to a stranger felt safer than continuing to process these emotions alone. She listened without judgment as I described Thomas's final disappointment in our son, Michael's choice to leave the burial early, and the way the inheritance conditions had ultimately served as a test of character that Michael had failed. "What strikes me most," Dr. Rodriguez said when I finished, "is how your husband's wisdom is creating a positive impact even after his death. The research this donation will fund could literally save children's lives. Your son's choice to prioritize a social obligation over family loyalty is funding hope for families facing every parent's worst nightmare." The irony wasn't lost on me. Michael's selfishness was inadvertently creating something beautiful and life-giving. Children who would never know our family's story might live longer, healthier lives, because my son had chosen Vanessa's grandmother's anniversary party over his father's burial. "We'd like to establish the Thomas Lawson Memorial Research Fund," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "Would you be interested in visiting our facility sometime? We could show you the kind of work your husband's gift will support." I accepted her invitation, scheduling a visit for the following week. After hanging up, I realized that this was the first time since Thomas's death that I'd made plans extending beyond my immediate daily routine. The prospect of seeing tangible evidence of how his legacy would continue felt both healing and empowering. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in the garden planting the herbs I'd bought during my grocery store expedition when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Looking up, I saw Vanessa stepping out of a gleaming white luxury sedan, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the October wind. My first instinct was panic. Vanessa had never visited me alone, had rarely spoken to me directly during the few occasions when she and Michael had come to dinner. Her presence in my driveway felt like an invasion, a violation of the peaceful space I'd been creating. She was dressed impeccably as always, wearing what looked like designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry understated but obviously expensive. Everything about her presentation suggested someone accustomed to making an impression, to being taken seriously based on appearance alone. "Mrs. Lawson," she said as she approached, her voice carrying the carefully modulated tone of someone who'd been trained in diplomacy. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I was in the area visiting a client, and I thought we should talk." I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves, acutely aware of how I must look in my old clothes with soil under my fingernails. But for the first time in our limited relationship, I didn't feel embarrassed by the contrast between us. This was my home, my garden, my choice to spend Friday morning planting basil and oregano. "Of course," I said politely. "Would you like to come in?" She glanced at the house, taking in the painter's equipment, still stacked on the porch, and the smell of fresh paint that lingered in the air. "Actually, could we sit out here? It's such a beautiful day." I gestured to the patio furniture Thomas had bought years ago, simple but comfortable chairs that looked out over the backyard. Vanessa settled herself carefully, crossing her legs and placing her expensive handbag on the table between us. "I wanted to talk to you about the situation with Michael's inheritance," she began, her tone businesslike and direct. "I think there's been a misunderstanding that we can resolve." "What kind of misunderstanding?" "Well, the circumstances of the funeral were complicated. Michael was torn between competing family obligations, and he made the best decision he could under difficult circumstances. I don't think Thomas really intended to penalize him for trying to honor commitments to both sides of the family." The careful phrasing was classic Vanessa, turning Michael's abandonment of his father's burial into a noble attempt to balance competing loyalties. She'd managed to reframe selfish choice as sacrifice, absence as presence. "Thomas was very specific about his intentions," I said calmly. "He wanted Michael to prioritize family over social convenience. Michael chose otherwise, but surely you can see that the situation was more nuanced than that." The anniversary celebration had been planned for over a year. My grandparents specifically requested Michael's presence. "These aren't just social obligations, Mrs. Lawson. They're family relationships that impact our future, our business connections, our standing in the community. And those relationships were more important than seeing Thomas to his final rest." Vanessa's composure slipped slightly, a flash of irritation crossing her features before she regained control. "It wasn't about importance, it was about timing. If the funeral had been scheduled for a different day, or if your family had been more flexible about the arrangements, none of this would have been an issue." The audacity was breathtaking. She was suggesting that we should have scheduled Thomas's burial around her grandmother's party, that our grief should have accommodated her social calendar. Vanessa, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. Thomas died on Tuesday. We buried him on Saturday. Those weren't arbitrary choices made to inconvenience your family. I understand that, but surely you can see Michael's position. He's building relationships that will benefit him professionally for decades. One afternoon at a burial wouldn't have changed anything for Thomas, but missing the anniversary party could have damaged important connections. One afternoon at his father's burial, I repeated, emphasizing each word. You're talking about my husband's funeral like it was a minor scheduling conflict. That's not what I meant. Vanessa leaned forward, her expression becoming more earnest, more calculated. I'm trying to explain that Michael's decision wasn't disrespectful. It was practical. Thomas was a practical man. He would have understood the importance of maintaining relationships that could benefit the family's future prosperity. Thomas was a practical man. I agree. Practical enough to know that character matters more than connections, that integrity can't be purchased with networking opportunities. But surely he didn't mean to punish Michael so severely for one difficult choice. $100,000, Mrs. Lawson. That's not just money, it's security. It's our children's education fund, our retirement savings, your children's education fund, children that didn't exist, might never exist, but were already being used as emotional leverage in Vanessa's argument. I wondered if she'd practiced this conversation, if she'd rehearsed the talking points designed to make me feel guilty for supporting my husband's final wishes. The money is going to children's cancer research, I said. It will fund studies that might save lives. That seems like a worthy use of Thomas's legacy. Of course charity is important, but family should come first. Michael is Thomas's son. Blood should matter more than strangers, no matter how deserving they might be. Michael had the opportunity to demonstrate that family mattered to him. He chose not to. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, perhaps realizing that her appeals to sentiment weren't working. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted, becoming more direct and businesslike. What would it take to reverse this decision? The will can be contested. Michael has grounds to argue that Thomas wasn't in his right mind when he made these conditions, that the cancer treatment affected his judgment. Thomas was completely lucid when he worked with his attorney. There's documentation to support his mental competence, but surely there's some room for negotiation. What if Michael made a significant donation to a charity of your choice? What if he committed to more frequent visits, better communication? There has to be something that would satisfy the spirit of what Thomas wanted without such a harsh financial penalty. I looked at this beautiful, polished young woman who was trying to negotiate her way around the consequences of her husband's choices, and I felt something click into place inside me. Vanessa wasn't here because she was sorry about Michael's behavior. She wasn't concerned about our relationship or interested in making amends. She was here because losing $100,000 was inconvenient, and she believed that with the right combination of pressure and persuasion, she could convince me to override my dead husband's wishes. Vanessa, I said quietly, do you know what Michael said when I told him about the inheritance conditions? She shook her head, clearly uncomfortable with the change in my tone. He said that your family was his real family now. He told me not to expect to hear from him anytime soon, that he needed time to process what he called our betrayal. He hung up on me without saying goodbye or expressing any concern for how I might manage as a new widow. Vanessa's face flushed slightly, perhaps realizing that Michael's reaction had undermined any argument she might make about his commitment to family relationships. He was upset, she said weakly. People say things they don't mean when they're emotional. Maybe, but they also reveal what they really think when they're under pressure. Michael revealed that in his mind, I'm no longer family. You're family. Your parents are family. Your grandmother's anniversary party was a family obligation, but his father's burial was just an inconvenience. That's not fair. Michael loves you. Michael loves the idea of me, the mother who raised him, who sacrificed for his education, who made excuses for his behavior even when it became inexcusable. But he doesn't love me enough to treat me with basic respect or consideration. Vanessa stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. "This is ridiculous. You're punishing Michael for being successful, for marrying well, for building a life that extends beyond this small town. You and Thomas could never accept that he outgrew your narrow little world." There it was, the contempt that had always lurked beneath Vanessa's polite facade, the disdain for our modest home and simple lifestyle that she'd never quite managed to hide. In her mind, Michael's treatment of us was justified because we weren't worthy of respect in the first place. "You're right," I said, standing to face her. "Michael did outgrow us. He outgrew the values we taught him, the respect we modeled, the love we freely gave. He traded those things for acceptance in your world, and apparently he's decided it was a good trade." "Fine," Vanessa snapped, grabbing her handbag and heading toward her car. "Keep your husband's money and your righteous indignation, but don't expect Michael to come crawling back when you decide you want a relationship with your son again." She drove away without another word, her luxury sedan disappearing around the corner like an expensive mirage. I stood in my driveway for several minutes afterward, shaking slightly from the confrontation but also feeling oddly liberated. The last pretense had been stripped away. There would be no reconciliation, no family healing, no mutual understanding. Michael and Vanessa had made their position clear, and I had made mine. That evening, I called Sarah to tell her about Vanessa's visit. My daughter listened without interruption as I recounted the conversation, the barely veiled threats about contesting the will, and Vanessa's final outburst about our narrow little world. "I can't say I'm surprised," Sarah said when I finished. "Vanessa's always looked at our family like we were some kind of quaint historical exhibit. The fact that she drove all the way from Chicago to try to manipulate you into changing Dad's will tells you everything you need to know about her priorities. I think it's really over now," I said. "Whatever relationship I had with Michael, whatever hope I had that things might improve, it's finished. Are you okay with that?" "I think I am. For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe without worrying about disappointing him or failing to meet his expectations. It's sad, but it's also freeing." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled all this. Dad would be proud too. You've honored his wishes and stood up for what's right, even though it cost you a relationship with Michael." "It didn't cost me a relationship with Michael. Michael's choices cost me that relationship years ago. I just finally stopped pretending otherwise." The next week I visited the Children's Cancer Research Foundation as planned. Rodriguez gave me a tour of their laboratories and treatment facilities, introducing me to researchers who were working on the kind of projects that Thomas's donation would support. I met families whose children were enrolled in clinical trials, parents who spoke with the desperate hope of people fighting for their child's life. "The research we're able to fund makes a real difference," Dr. Rodriguez explained as we watched technicians preparing samples for analysis. "Every breakthrough brings us closer to turning fatal diagnoses into treatable conditions." I thought about Michael's children's education fund, the hypothetical savings for hypothetical futures that Vanessa had used as an argument for overturning the will. These children fighting for the chance to have any future at all seemed like a more worthy investment than college funds for kids who might never be born. "We're planning a small ceremony next month to officially establish the Thomas Lawson Memorial Fund," Dr. Rodriguez. "We'd love to have you there, and we'd welcome any family members who might want to attend." "I'll be there," I said, "but I think I'll be the only family representative." On the drive home, I thought about the different ways people choose to be remembered. Thomas would be remembered for funding research that could save lives, for using his final wishes to teach a lesson about priorities and values. Michael would be remembered, if at all, as the son who chose a party over his father's burial. The contrast seemed fitting. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since high school. I started writing in a journal. Not because anyone had suggested it, or because I thought it might be therapeutic, but because I had thoughts and observations that seemed worth preserving. I wrote about the day's visit to the research center, about Vanessa's unexpected appearance in my garden, about the way my transformed house was beginning to feel like home again. I also wrote about the future, about plans that were beginning to take shape in my mind. The Spanish classes would start next month. The book club met for the first time in 2 weeks. I was considering joining a hiking group for women over 50 that met at local state parks. Small steps perhaps, but they were all mine. November arrived with a cold snap that turned the leaves brilliant shades of orange and red, before stripping them from the trees. I spent a weekend afternoon raking and composting, physical work that felt meditative and purposeful. Miss Anderson's husband Dan stopped by to discuss plans for the greenhouse he'd offered to help me build, sketching designs on a legal pad, while we sat at my kitchen table. The foundation work will need to wait until spring, he explained, but we could get the materials ordered now and start planning the layout. What kind of plants are you hoping to grow? I found myself describing an ambitious vision of herbs and vegetables, maybe some flowers for cutting, possibly even attempting to grow tomatoes year-round. As I talked, I realized I was planning for a future that extended well beyond the next few months, imagining projects and possibilities that assumed I would be here, in this house, building this life for years to come. That's definitely doable, Dan said, making notes about ventilation and heating options. You'll want to start with easier plants and work your way up to the more challenging ones. I like the idea of having something to learn, I said. I've spent so many years managing other people's needs, that I've forgotten what it feels like to pursue something purely for the joy of it. Dan smiled. Rita, you're going to be amazed by what you can grow when you give yourself permission to try. Permission to try. Such a simple concept, but one that felt revolutionary after decades of playing it safe, of making choices based on practicality rather than possibility. That night I sat in my transformed reading room with a cup of tea, and one of the books Margaret Chen had recommended from the Fellowship's reading list. The sage green chair was perfectly positioned to catch the light from the reading lamp, and the yellow walls created a warm cocoon that invited contemplation. The book was about women who had reinvented themselves later in life, stories of courage and creativity and second chance. I read until midnight, inspired by accounts of women who had started businesses in their 60s, traveled solo to foreign countries in their 70s, returned to school in their 80s. Each story reinforced what I was beginning to understand about my own life, that endings could also be beginnings, that loss could create space for growth, that the courage to disappoint some people was the price of finally living authentically. I fell asleep that night feeling excited about tomorrow in a way I hadn't experienced since I was young enough to believe that anything was possible. The difference was that now I knew it actually was. The ceremony for the Thomas Lawson Memorial Fund took place on a gray, November afternoon at the Research Center. Dr. Rodriguez had arranged a small gathering in their conference room, with displays showing the specific research projects that would benefit from the donation. I wore my best dress, the navy one I'd bought for Michael's wedding, but this time it felt appropriate rather than inadequate.
Several researchers spoke about their work, explaining in layman's terms how the funding would accelerate their studies of childhood leukemia and brain tumors. I listened with genuine interest, amazed by the complexity of their investigations and the dedication they brought to their work. When it came time for me to speak, I found myself telling Thomas's story not as a tragedy about a disappointing son, but as a testament to the power of principled choices. I talked about his belief that character was revealed through actions, his conviction that love without accountability was meaningless, his hope that even his death could teach important lessons about priorities and values. Thomas wanted his legacy to reflect what he valued most, I concluded. Not wealth or status or social connections, but the fundamental decency of putting others before yourself, of doing what's right even when it's difficult. This research fund embodies those values in a way that will save lives and strengthen families for generations to come. After the ceremony, I drove to the cemetery to visit Thomas's grave. The headstone looked settled now, no longer stark and new against the winter-brown grass. I brought fresh flowers, yellow chrysanthemums that complemented the autumn landscape. I think you'd be proud of what the money is accomplishing, I told him, arranging the flowers in the vase we'd installed at the base of the stone. Michael and Vanessa aren't happy about it, but I think that proves you made the right choice. The wind rustled through the bare oak branches, and I imagined Thomas's approval in the sound. He'd always believed that the best decisions were often the most difficult ones, that doing what was right mattered more than being popular or keeping everyone happy. I'm doing well, I continued,
sitting on the ground beside the grave despite the cold seeping through my coat. I'm painting the house, making new friends, taking classes. I'm learning Spanish and planning a greenhouse, and reading books that make me think about big questions. I'm becoming someone I didn't know I could be. I stayed until the sun began to set, watching the sky turn pink and orange above the valley Thomas had loved. When I finally got up to leave, brushing dead grass from my coat, I felt like I was saying goodbye to more than just his grave. I was letting go of the last vestiges of the woman I'd been when he was alive, the one who defined herself through relationships and obligations rather than dreams and possibilities. The drive home took me past the community college where I would start Spanish classes the following week. The building was lit up against the early darkness, and I could see people coming and going from evening classes. Soon I would be one of them, a student again for the first time in over 40 years, learning something new purely because it interested me. At home, I found a message on my answering machine from Margaret Chen, inviting me to a potluck dinner at the fellowship before our next book club meeting. There was also a message from Sarah, just checking in and telling me she loved me. No messages from Michael, no attempts at reconciliation or apology, just the sounds of a life moving forward without him. I spent the evening planning my contribution to the potluck, deciding on a recipe for butternut squash soup that I'd never tried before. It felt fitting somehow, bringing something new and untested to a gathering of people who were still getting to know me, taking risks, making attempts, allowing for the possibility of failure or success without the weight of other people's expectations. Later, as I prepared for bed in my rearranged bedroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. She looked confident, purposeful, alive in ways that went beyond mere physical health. She looked like someone with plans and projects and places to go. She looked like someone who had finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between independence and isolation. Someone who understood that the best relationships were chosen rather than obligated, built on mutual respect rather than family obligation or social convenience. For the first time since Thomas's death, I went to sleep looking forward to tomorrow rather than simply enduring it. And for the first time since Michael's childhood, I fell asleep without worrying about anyone else's needs or expectations or disappointment. I was finally, completely, undeniably free. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that felt personal rather than merely seasonal. The greenhouse Dan Henderson had helped me build stood gleaming in the backyard, its glass panels catching the morning light like a promise. Inside, seedlings I'd started from scratch were reaching toward the sun, green proof that new growth was possible even after the harshest winter. I was transplanting tomato seedlings when the phone rang on a warm April morning. The caller ID showed a Chicago number I didn't recognize, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something made me wipe my hands on my gardening apron and answer anyway. Mrs. Lawson? This is Dr. Tricia Whitman from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Michael Lawson. The words hit me like ice water. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the months of silence and anger, he was still my child. My heart hammered against my ribs as I prepared for the worst. What's happened? I managed to ask. He's been in a serious car accident. He's stable now, but he's been unconscious for 3 days. His wife gave us your contact information and asked us to call you. 3 days. Michael had been fighting for his life for 3 days, and this was the first I was hearing about it. I wondered if Vanessa had hesitated before giving them my number, if she'd debated whether I deserved to know or if my presence would be welcome. How serious is it? I asked, already reaching for my car keys with my free hand. He has multiple fractures and a traumatic brain injury. We're cautiously optimistic, but the next 48 hours will be critical. Are you able to come to Chicago? I'm on my way. The drive to Chicago took 6 hours. 6 hours of wrestling with emotions I thought I'd resolved. Anger at being excluded from the crisis, fear for Michael's life, uncertainty about whether I would even be welcome at his bedside. I called Sarah from a rest stop in Southern Oregon, and she immediately offered to fly in from Seattle. Whatever happened between you and Michael, he's still your son, she said simply, and you're still his mother. I arrived at Northwestern Memorial as the sun was setting, painting the hospital walls in shades of orange and pink. The ICU was a maze of beeping machines and hushed voices, a place where time moved differently, and hope hung heavy in the recycled air. Vanessa was sitting in the waiting room, her perfect appearance finally showing cracks. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her designer clothes wrinkled from days of hospital vigil. When she saw me, her face cycled through surprise, relief, and something that might have been shame. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, standing to greet me. "I wasn't sure if you would. Where is he?" She led me down the hallway to a room where my son lay connected to more machines than I could count. Michael's face was swollen and bruised, his left arm in a cast, his head wrapped in white bandages, but he was breathing on his own, and the monitors showed steady vital signs. I pulled a chair close to his bed and took his uninjured hand in mine. It was warm, familiar despite everything that had changed between us. For a moment he was just my little boy again, the one who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, who brought me dandelions like they were roses. "How did it happen?" I asked Vanessa, who had followed me into the room. A drunk driver ran a red light, hit him on the passenger side. Her voice cracked slightly. He was coming home from a business dinner. If he'd left 5 minutes earlier or late. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the machines that were monitoring Michael's recovery. I found myself studying his face, looking for traces of the boy I'd raised, the young man who had once called me every Sunday just to chat about his week. "Miss Lawson," Vanessa said finally, "I owe you an apology for what I said at your house last fall, for the way I've treated you and Thomas. I was wrong." I looked at her, this woman who had seemed so confident and untouchable just months ago. Now she looked fragile, frightened, like someone who had discovered that money and connections couldn't protect the people you loved from life's random cruelties. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because sitting here for 3 days, not knowing if he was going to wake up, made me realize what actually matters. Michael talks about you sometimes, when he thinks I'm not listening. He misses you, he regrets how things ended, but he's too proud to admit it. And you're telling me this because pride is a luxury we can't afford when someone we love is fighting for their life. Because if something happens to him, I don't want his last conversation with his mother to have been angry words about money." I stayed at the hospital for the next 2 days, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs and surviving on cafeteria coffee. Sarah arrived on Wednesday evening, and the 3 of us maintained an awkward but peaceful vigil together. We took turns reading to Michael from the newspaper, talking to him about everyday things in hopes that familiar voices might reach whatever part of him was still fighting to return. On Thursday morning, Michael's eyes opened. It was subtle at first, just a flutter of eyelids that made me think I was imagining things, but then he focused on my face, confusion giving way to recognition, and then to something that looked like relief. "Mom!" His voice was barely a whisper, rough from the breathing tube that had been removed the day before. "I'm here," I said, squeezing his hand gently. "I'm right here." He closed his eyes again, but his grip on my hand tightened slightly. It was the first real communication we'd had since that terrible phone call in June, and it felt like a miracle. Over the next week, as Michael's condition steadily improved, we began to have actual conversation. Not about the inheritance or the funeral or the months of silence between us, but about small things: the weather, the hospital food, the book Sarah was reading to him during her afternoon visits. It was Vanessa who finally brought up the subject we'd all been avoiding. "Michael," she said one afternoon when I was visiting alone, "there's something we need to discuss, about your father's funeral, about the will, about the things that have happened between you and your mother." Michael's face tightened, and I could see him preparing his defense. But before he could speak, Vanessa continued, "I was wrong to encourage you to leave early that day. I was wrong to prioritize my family's expectations over your father's funeral, and I was especially wrong to try to convince your mother to override his final wish." Michael stared at his wife in shock. This was clearly not a conversation they'd had before, not a position Vanessa had ever articulated. "I've been thinking about it every day since the accident," she went, "about what your father was trying to teach you, about why he felt the need to put conditions on your inheritance. He wasn't trying to punish you, Michael. He was trying to save you." "Save me from what?" Michael asked weakly. "From becoming someone who measures relationships in terms of personal advantage, from turning into the kind of person who attends funerals out of obligation rather than love, from losing touch with the values that actually matter." I watched this exchange with amazement. The woman who had sat in my garden demanding that I reverse Thomas's decision was now defending his wisdom to her own husband. The money's gone, Michael said finally, to charity. There's nothing to discuss anymore. Yes, there is, Vanessa said firmly. There's your relationship with your mother. There's the question of what kind of man you want to be going forward. There's whether you've learned anything from almost losing your life. Michael turned to look at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen there in years, vulnerability. I'm sorry, Mom, he said quietly, for leaving Dad's burial early, for hanging up on you, for saying that Vanessa's family was my real family. I was angry and defensive, and I said things I didn't mean. Which parts didn't you mean? I asked gently. He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. I meant that I was hurt. I felt like Dad was punishing me for trying to balance different obligations, but I didn't mean that you weren't my family anymore. I didn't mean that our relationship didn't matter to me, but you did choose to leave your father's burial for a party. Yes, he said, his voice barely audible. I did, and I've regretted it every day since. It wasn't everything I needed to hear, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of choice and consequence, of hurt given and received. We talked for another hour that day, not resolving everything but beginning the slow work of rebuilding trust that had been damaged by years of misplaced priorities. Michael was released from the hospital 2 weeks later, with instructions for months of physical therapy and cognitive rehabilitation. The brain injury had affected his short-term memory and concentration, making it impossible for him to return to his high-stress consulting job immediately. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that the accident had forced him to slow down in ways that Thomas's death and my grief never could. Vanessa asked if I would consider staying in Chicago for a few weeks to help with Michael's recovery. The request surprised me, not just because she was making it, but because I found myself genuinely considering it. I can't stay indefinitely, I told her. I have a life in Oregon now, commitments and activities that matter to me. I understand that, but maybe just until he's more stable. I'm not good at this kind of caregiving, and I think he needs his mother. So I stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping in their guest room, and helping Michael with basic tasks as he regained his strength. It was strange being in their house, surrounded by the luxury and sophistication that had once intimidated me, but now it just looked like expensive furniture and designer accessories, beautiful but somehow hollow. What struck me most was how little evidence there was of genuine friendship or community in their lives. The refrigerator held no family photos, no children's artwork, no casual snapshots of good times with people who mattered. The only visitors during Michael's recovery were business associates, who stopped by briefly to check on his progress and discuss work coverage. Don't you have friends? I asked Vanessa one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. We have acquaintances, she said carefully. People we see at charity events and business functions, but real friends, the kind who would bring you casseroles when you're in crisis, I don't think we do. I thought about my own life back home, about Miss Henderson checking on me daily during my first weeks of widowhood, about Margaret Chen and the book club that had become genuine friends, about Dan building me a greenhouse, simply because he enjoyed helping neighbors. I'd been living with more authentic community in my modest house than Michael and Vanessa had, in their expensive isolation. The conversation that changed everything happened on my last night in Chicago. Michael was feeling well enough to stay up late, and the three of us were sitting in their living room, talking about his recovery plans, and my return to Oregon. Mom, Michael said suddenly, I want you to know that I understand now what Dad was trying to do, with the will, with the condition. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. What do you think he saw? That I was losing my way, that I was becoming someone who cared more about appearances than authenticity, more about impressing people than loving them, that I was turning into the kind of person who would miss his own father's burial for a networking opportunity. It was the most honest thing Michael had said to me in years, and I could see the pain it cost him to acknowledge it. I can't undo what I did, he continued. I can't go back and make different choices, but I can try to be better going forward. I can try to become the kind of man Dad hoped I could be. What would that look like? I asked. I don't know yet. Different priorities, maybe. Different definitions of success. Less focus on accumulating status and more attention to relationships that actually matter. Vanessa reached over and took his hand, and I could see that this was a conversation they'd been having privately, a reckoning that had been building since the accident. "We've been talking about making some changes," she said, "maybe moving somewhere smaller, somewhere we could actually be part of a community instead of just performing for one." "What kind of changes?" "Michael can do consulting work from anywhere with internet access," Vanessa explained. "We don't have to live in Chicago. We could find a place where people know their neighbors, where relationships matter more than resumes." I thought about my small town, about the neighbors who had rallied around me during Thomas's illness, and after his death, about the community college classes, and hiking groups, and volunteer opportunities that had given my life new meaning and purpose. "You could move closer to home," I said carefully, "not to the same town necessarily, but to the same region, somewhere within a few hours' drive, instead of a 6-hour journey." Michael and Vanessa exchanged a look that told me this possibility had already occurred to them. "Would you want that?" Michael asked. "After everything that's happened, would you want us near?" It was a fair question, one that required an honest answer. Did I want to rebuild a relationship with my son? Was I willing to risk the peace and independence I'd found by opening my life to people who had hurt me so deep? "I'd want the chance to find out who we could be to each other now," I said finally. "Not who we used to be, but who we might become if we're all willing to do the work." 6 months later, Michael and Vanessa moved to a small town 45 minutes from my house. They bought a modest Victorian that needed restoration, the kind of project that would require them to learn new skills and rely on local contractors and neighbors for advice and assistance. It was a dramatic change from their previous lifestyle, but one that seemed to energize rather than diminish them. Michael's recovery was slow but steady. The brain injury had affected his ability to multitask and handle stress, making his previous high-pressure career impossible. But it had also given him a different perspective on what constituted meaningful work. He started taking on smaller consulting projects for nonprofit organizations, using his business skills to help groups that couldn't afford major firms. Vanessa surprised everyone, including herself, by discovering a talent for historic renovation. She threw herself into researching period-appropriate materials and techniques, building relationships with local craftspeople and suppliers. The woman who had once seemed interested only in appearance and status, became genuinely passionate about preserving something with authentic historical value. We didn't pretend that everything was fixed, or that the past could be erased. Michael still struggled with the memory of leaving Thomas's burial early, and I still grieved for the years we'd lost to misplaced priorities and damaged communication. But we were building something new, something based on who we were now, rather than who we'd been before. The real test came that winter, when I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Rodriguez at the Children's Cancer Research Foundation. "Mrs. Lawson, I wanted to let you know that the research funded by your husband's memorial donation has led to a breakthrough in pediatric leukemia treatment. The new protocol we were able to develop is showing remarkable success rates in early trials." The news was overwhelming in the best possible way. Thomas's money, the inheritance Michael had forfeited, was literally saving children's lives. I called Michael immediately to share the news, and for the first time since his recovery, I heard him cry. "Dad's legacy," he said through his tears, "that's his real legacy. Not money passed down to ungrateful children, but research that will help families who are fighting for their children's lives. It could have been your legacy too," I reminded him gently. "If you'd made different choices, I know, but maybe this is better." Maybe I needed to lose that money to understand what I'd really lost when I walked away from Dad's burial. We started spending holidays together again, but differently than before. Instead of elaborate meals focused on impressing each other, we shared simple dinners, centered on conversation and genuine connection. Michael and Vanessa volunteered with local organizations, building the kind of community relationships they'd never prioritized in Chicago. On the second anniversary of Thomas's death, we all went to the cemetery together. Michael brought flowers and a letter he'd written to his father, an apology and a promise that he read aloud at the graveside. Vanessa brought a photo of children who had benefited from the leukemia research, young faces full of hope and possibility. "I think he'd be proud of what his money accomplished," Michael said, as we prepared to leave. "I think he'd be proud of what you're becoming," I replied. The cemetery was quiet except for the wind in the oak trees. Thomas had loved, and I imagined his approval in that sound. Not for the money, or the research, though those mattered, but for the slow, difficult work of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by pride and misplaced priority. As we walked back to our cars, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. Thomas's final wishes had seemed harsh when I first learned about them, a punishment that destroyed my relationship with my son. But time had revealed them to be something else entirely, a gift that forced all of us to examine our priorities and choose what really mattered. Michael had lost his inheritance, but found his way back to his family. Vanessa had lost her social status, but discovered genuine community. I had lost the son I thought I knew, but gained a relationship with the man he was becoming. The money was gone, donated to research that would save lives and strengthen families for generations to come. But the love remained, changed and challenged, and ultimately made stronger by the test Thomas had designed. Standing in the cemetery parking lot, saying goodbye to Michael and Vanessa before returning to our separate homes, I felt grateful for the difficult path we'd traveled. Not because it had been easy, but because it had been necessary. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even if it costs you a relationship in the short term. Thomas had understood that love without accountability was meaningless, that inheritance without character was worthless. His final gift to our family wasn't money, but the chance to discover who we really were when tested by loss and consequence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.